Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this is History 11, and today's lecture is titled Mastering the New World. The main idea we are trying to communicate is on your screen, called the thesis statement. By the 1720s, England's North American colonies controlled the new environment. By subduing Indians and enslaving Africans, they had erected the basic structures of colonial life, secured them against European competitors, and became generally self-reliant. Our title, Mastering the New World, has a double meaning, if you will. It implies not only mastering the new environment, but doing it by becoming masters of slaves. So in this lecture, we take a pretty close look at the transatlantic slave trade. We should point out as a introductory matter that about 12 million Africans were forcibly transported from the African continent to the North American hemisphere, to the North American, Central American, South American, and Caribbean areas, sometimes called the Americas. About 5% of that total arrived in British North America, probably about 500,000 or so. But their labor and their skills were crucial to the economic and social development of the colonies and later the United States. African people mixed continuously with Native Americans and with white Europeans. And the race relations, as one historian has said, that grew out of slavery profoundly affected the development of the United States to the present hour. Now, the slave trade, in this case, refers to the trafficking of slaves from one location to another. Now, first of all, a great deal could be said about the history of slavery. Slavery has a long, sordid, troubled history. And probably slavery is as old as the world. We don't know when the first slaves existed, but if you go back, if one were to go back and study ancient Mesopotamian states between the Tigris and Euphrates River, or Egypt, or later the civilizations in India and in China and in different parts of the world, slavery is always there. So slavery is probably as old as the world, or as old as civilization. And there was slavery in Africa also before the Europeans ever arrived. Slavery has ancient roots in African society. Arab and Moorish traders began the African slave trade probably earlier than the 8th century to fill labor shortages in the Mediterranean area. And then when the Portuguese sailed down the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, they purchased captives of war and prisoners from natives. While slavery and slave trading probably have existed, as we said, from the beginning of recorded history, slavery in Africa had existed for thousands of years, and slave labor was common in West Africa. When Portuguese voyagers first arrived in Africa in the 15th century, they found an extensive slave trade conducted by the Islamic nations that involved capture and sale of Europeans and mixed race North Africans called Berbers, as well as Black people from south of the Sahara Desert. Christians, Muslims, and people from other religious groups have involved themselves in the slave trade over time. This map shows us the trans-Saharan slave trade. The Sahara Desert is the sort of the darker area in the north part of Africa, you can see on your screen. And then those black lines and the dotted lines represent trade routes across the Sahara Desert, which is the largest desert in the world. And so you have traffic from below the desert, called sub-Saharan Africa, across the desert into North Africa, and beyond that, of course, into Southwest Asia, the Mediterranean states. The trans-Saharan slave trade dealt mostly in women and children who, as slaves, were destined for lives as concubines and domestic servants in North Africa, in the Mediterranean states, Southwest Asia, and beyond. These are African women who were taken by Portuguese slave traders to Brazil, or what is today Brazil. So in that slave trade, women and children were more numerous than men because they were not going as agricultural workers, they were going as domestic servants and concubines. When Portuguese ships first arrived off the Guinea coast, their captains traded primarily for gold, for ivory, pepper, and other luxury goods and spices, but they also wanted slaves. As early as 1441, Antão Gonçalves of Portugal enslaved a Berber and his West African servant and took them home as gifts for a Portuguese prince. During the following decades of the mid to late 15th century, Portuguese raiders captured hundreds of Africans for service as domestic servants in Portugal and in Spain. But what caused the slave trade to grow dramatically was sugar. The Columbus voyages showed that you could go to the Western Hemisphere, you could found colonies whose climates were suitable for growing profitable agricultural commodities like sugar and rice and later cotton. And then you could enslave Indians as a labor supply. Now, so sugar was cultivated first in Madeira off the coast of the mainland and then in the Caribbean islands. In 1501, the Spanish king and queen Ferdinand and Isabella, who had financed Columbus's voyage, gave Catholic governor Nicolas de Ovando, the third governor of the Indies, written permission to import African slaves to Hispaniola, or that island that today on the right side has the Dominican Republic and on the left, Haiti. As early as 1502, there were African slaves on the island of Hispaniola, and Ovando brutalized the indigenous Tainos who were there. This letter, of course, in Spanish, authorizes the governor of the Indies, Nicolas de Ovando, to import African slaves to that island. These two images are from the island of Antigua in the British West Indies, called Cutting the Sugar Cane on the left, and then on the right, Shipping Sugar. This map shows us Spanish sugar producing areas around 1600. Now in the yellow, you can see the areas controlled by Spain. Because Europe provided an almost insatiable market for sugar, cultivation of this one crop in the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, and especially in the Caribbean and off the east coast of South America, where the Portuguese founded Brazil, became extremely profitable. Sugar plantations employing slave labor spread from Brazil to the Caribbean islands or the British West Indies. Later, the cultivation of tobacco, rice, and indigo in British North America added to the demand for African slaves, although far more Africans went to Brazil than ever reached British North America. You can see by this chart a fairly informed estimate of how many slaves ended up in particular areas of the world. The greatest number, in fact, so in the lower left hand, you can see the approximate totals, and then you can see the arrows where those areas are. You can see the greatest number of African slaves went to the West Indies, over 4 million, and that doesn't count all the people that died in the Middle Passage. And then the second largest area in terms of having received African slaves was Brazil, run by the Portuguese. This is from Professor Philip Kurt of the University of Wisconsin. So the greatest number of African slaves went to the West Indies, followed by Portuguese Brazil. Now, how did the process of enslavement actually occur? That's what this point is trying to explain. First, there's the capture of Africans in the interior, then the march to the coast and to the slave castles or the forts, and then the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. This is a bronze figurine of slaves chained together or roped together in a coffle. As warfare spread to the interior of Africa, captives had to march hundreds of miles to the coast where European traders awaited them. Raiders tied the captives together with rope or secured them with wooden yokes about their necks. It was a shocking experience, and many captives died from hunger, exhaustion, and exposure during the journey. Others killed themselves rather than submit to their fate, and captors often killed those who resisted. This is a photograph of the Cape Coast Castle, a slave fort in modern-day Ghana. A fort or a castle was the headquarters of the European slave traders. The Europeans, whether they were Spanish or English or Dutch, whatever the case may be, they got permission from African kings to build these forts, and then they paid rent on them. So they had permission, as it were, to be there, and they waited for African slaves to be brought to them. Here, the slave traders lived. They had dormitories, they had kitchens, and then they had basements or dungeons below where the slaves were taken and kept to prepare them for life in the boats. The Cape Coast Castle, you see pictured here, was one of a dozen such forts operated by Britain, Spain, or the Netherlands, and it held hundreds and over time thousands of slaves. Captains of slave ships paid about 6 ounces of gold or 200 gallons of rum for each slave. The price was lower, we learn, if the captains wanted to deal directly with African chieftains, but that required long, dangerous trips inland. So most Europeans waited on the coast for the African slaves to be brought to them. So the Europeans would choose a tribe, arm it, and pay it vast sums of money to bring in captives from other tribes. This is an article from the New York Times showing the tourism industry that is being promoted very successfully today by the government of Ghana. And the government of Ghana today promotes tourism of these former slave sites, including the slave trade fort, the Cape Coast Castle that I just showed you in in the prior picture. This map shows 11 coastal slave forts, which were the headquarters of the European slave traders who got permission from African kings to build the forts and then paid rent on them. One slave fort we can see is located inland near Timbuktu. After being held in the basement or dungeon of a slave castle for months, slaves were chained in rowboats and ferried out to the slave ships or the slavers that bobbed menacingly in the water. If possible, some captives would try to break free and swim to safety, while others tragically drowned in their escape efforts. This drawing shows African slaves in a ship in the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, always capitalized out of reverence and respect, was a 7 to 8 week journey across the Atlantic in chains. This view of the Middle Passage is generally considered to be somewhat humane in the sense that slaves are not chained to the floor and have some room to move about. Later, as on-board death or mortality rates started to climb, ship captains began to engage in a cynical, economically efficient practice called tight packing, an effort to squeeze Africans together to make up for deaths that occurred in the Middle Passage. The result was that ships were loaded far beyond their intended capacity. You can see in the red at the top there that cargo hold where slaves are put. This drawing shows the tightly packed interior of the slave ship Vigilante. On board, 227 male slaves were confined to a room 37 by 22 feet, 37 feet wide by 22 feet wide. To ensure a profitable voyage, as we said, European ship captains exceeded the ordinary the loads slave ships were designed to carry. The instruments of slavery. Slavery, of course, was upheld by the most brutal, severe, sadistic practices. At the top, the infamous thumb screws. If a slave was believed to be in possession of information and would not disclose it, or something like that, his or her thumbs were put into those two slots like that, and then the key was turned like that to crush their thumbs, or until the slave told the captain what he thought the captain wanted to know. At the bottom, the notorious speculum oris, you can see that it's collapsible like that, and it has a serrated edge. That was used to open slaves' mouths to force feed them, because a lot of slaves were in shock and did not want to eat. So this was a way to force them to eat, to ensure that they lived and survived to the end of the voyage. This man, Olaudah Equiano, was a slave and endured the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World and actually lived to write about it. This is what he wrote about the Middle Passage, quote, "Those white men with horrible looks, red faces and long hair looked and acted in so savage a manner. I had never seen among my people such instances of brutal cruelty." Historian Gary Nash has written that such fears were the product of deliberate European brutalization of the captives, part of the attempt to destroy the African self-respect and self-identity. We call this confined confusion. Notice you can see you can see slaves in a cargo hold of a tightly packed slave ship. And then you can see in red on the right, you have to sort of look this way. It says the measurement of the cargo hold is 3 feet 3 inches in height. That's 39 inches, that's not even 40 inches. Well, you can, and these slaves are chained to the floor. A bucket is passed around for them to go to the bathroom, and food is passed around hand to hand. So disease is just coursed through these cargo hold. People die in their chains, others go mad. It's a brutalization that no one could imagine, I don't think. This is called African slaves on the deck of the slave ship after the Middle Passage. After the Middle Passage, slaves are brought to the deck for fresh air. There are many written accounts of slaves whose bodies are damaged and wounded and injured, and accounts of ship personnel taking ointments to cover their wounds and try to heal them. You can see on this particular, in this particular image of slaves who have been brought to the Americas, that there's an accurate representation of the male to female ratio. You can see on the deck, most of the enslaved Africans are men, but the women and the babies are up in that deck further back toward the end of the ship. So the transatlantic slave trade was primarily African men with a few African women who were coming as agricultural workers. This is the reverse of the trans-Sahara slave trade, which was mostly women and children. There were some men in the trans-Sahara slave trade going to places like Morocco or Egypt as soldiers, or perhaps workers on large public works projects like dams and things like that. This is a famous painting by the great African-American artist Romare Bearden called Roots Odyssey. 20th century artist Romare Bearden presents a stylized depiction of the Odyssey of captives from Africa to the United States. The ship shows the low decks that were constructed on slaving vessels so that the maximum number of African captives could be transported. So these are tightly packed. A man's silhouette frames a view of the African continent. And this man is African American because he's wearing an American flag as a shirt. And then you can see in the left, seabirds thought to symbolize the souls of Africans returning to their homeland. Romare Bearden. That is a short summary of the transatlantic slave trade. And we will continue to talk about its effects as we continue in the class. What you are about to see in the next slide is different than what you have seen so far in this lecture. The transatlantic slave trade that brought 10 million to 12 million African slaves to the Americas is without parallel in the entirety of human history. Therefore, we cannot and dare not minimize what happened to Africans and African Americans. But the document you are about to see shows us that slavery continues to the present day, even though it looks different, vastly different from the history of the transatlantic slave trade, but it is slavery nonetheless. So we never want to minimize or pull down the historical importance of the transatlantic slave trade. But we need to talk about ongoing slavery. This is a document published by the US government in 1999 when President Bill Clinton was still in the White House, titled International Trafficking in Women to the United States. A contemporary or modern manifestation of slavery and organized crime. And I've circled on the right side of your screen the introductory sentences. Trafficking of women and children for the sex industry and for labor is prevalent in all regions of the United States. An estimated 45 to 50,000 women and children are trafficked annually every year to the United States, primarily by small crime rings and loosely connected criminal networks. According to this estimate, in the last 20 years, 1 million women and children have been transported and trafficked into the United States for the sex industry and for labor. So it's still with us. The Southern transition to black labor. The Southern states, as we know, had indentured servitude, particularly in the Chesapeake colonies, and I should not say states, in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. How was it that Southern colonies shifted slowly but surely over time from indentured servitude to slavery? As one historian has written, after the 1660s, indentured servitude in Virginia and Maryland began to lose its appeal because free land increasingly was available in newer colonies like Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And English women and men could obtain free land in those new colonies without indenturing themselves. England was also starting to gain more control over the Atlantic slave trade. So British control of the slave trade made African laborers cheaper if the tobacco colonies wanted them. Slavery in the northern colonies. Now, most people think that slavery existed only in the southern colonies, but in fact, slavery existed in every colony to a greater or lesser extent. How was northern slavery in the northern states, different than slavery in the southern states? Professor Ira Berlin from the University of Maryland has given us a very helpful way to know the difference. Professor Berlin said that the northern states were a society with slaves, whereas the southern states were a slave society. Slavery was never the foundation of the northern workforce because labor-intensive crops like tobacco, indigo, and rice could not grow in northern climes. Therefore, slaves were not necessary in the north. You could find them on a small family farm, or you could find them in a city like Boston or Philadelphia, New York, where they worked as artisans and domestic servants. One way, I think, to help explain this is to look at these two drawings here on your screen. Those drawings are supposed to represent a building, a multi-story building. Now on the left, you see a multi-story building with slavery at the bottom. This represents a slave society like those found in the southern colonies. The economy of the southern states, or colonies first, then the states, was built upon slave labor, like the foundation or basement of a building. So slavery is the bottom, and the entire southern colony builds its economy on top of that. So if you get rid of slavery, it's like destroying the foundation of a building. The whole economy collapses. And that is essentially what happened after the American Civil War. When slavery was outlawed, the southern economy nearly collapsed. On the right, you see a building where slavery is not the foundation, but it is on the rooftop, sort of like a fancy balcony or a fancy loft on the top of a building. The economy of the northern colonies and states was not built on slave labor. It was not essential, like a deck on a building's rooftop. When slavery was abolished in every northern state, the northern economy just went right on with little or no effect, because the northern economy was not built on slave labor. That's the difference. So we say that the northern colonies are a society with slaves, but the southern colonies are a slave society. Slavery was not the foundation, as we said, of the northern workforce, because labor-intensive crops did not grow there. In the north, there were mostly small farms. There was some commercial agriculture, like wheat and rye and other grains that were grown in western Pennsylvania and western New York. But farmers there just hired seasonal workers. Nevertheless, northern colonial economies did profit from the slave trade. Rum, which New Englanders distilled from West Indian sugar, was exchanged for slaves in Africa. Also, New England fish, wheat from the middle colonies, and barrel staves and hoops from North Carolina found markets in the slave-based West Indian economy. So northern colonies are a society with slaves, but they're deeply connected to the slave economy in the South and in the Caribbean. Slave culture. Slave culture. It's important to know that despite the severity of slavery, despite the cruelty and inhumanity and the discipline of it, slaves nonetheless were able to build meaningful lives for themselves. They didn't build full, complete lives as they would be able to do outside of slavery, or at least begin to do outside of slavery, but we don't want to minimize the manner in which they tried to build a meaningful culture under slavery. Masters tried to create a passive workforce by controlling the physical conditions of slaves. But Africans in America drew upon their African heritage in shaping family relationships, friendships, religion, and the use of leisure time. And in so doing, they laid the foundations for an African American culture. And we need to talk briefly about the growth of slavery in British North America. A relatively healthy environment compared to, say, the Caribbean, combined with a more even sex ratio than in other places, led to an unparalleled natural increase in the North American slave population. As plantations grew in size and the Chesapeake area became more densely settled, the possibilities for family life increased. You can see here in the African American population in a particular colony, say New York, in blue shows the African American population in 1680, 1200. But in red, it shows the population 60 years later. So New York went from about a little over 1,000, almost 9,000 in 60 years. Most of those slaves, at least in the North, were native born. The most African colony. The further south one goes, the more Africanized the culture. In the swampy rice plantations of South Carolina, the environment was not nearly as healthy as it was in the North. And here, slaves outnumbered whites 3-to-1. And because they were more numerous, slaves in the low country south of Georgia, and particularly in Georgia, South Carolina and later Georgia, slaves, because they were so numerous, were able to preserve more of their African culture. They gave their children African names. They kept alive a lot of African religious customs. You can see here a straw basket. In South Carolina, particularly on the sea islands off the coast of the Carolinas, slaves spoke Gullah. Gullah was a hybrid language made up of several African languages. And you can see here a Gullah straw basket. Gullah, sometimes called Geechee, is actually now the language of a New Testament Bible translation. Some have called it the Gospel according to Gullah. And the American Bible Society in 2005 started to publish a New Testament in Gullah. So a lot of people still speak that language, enough to make worthwhile a New Testament translation in that language. However, as one goes further north and the numbers and the ratio of Africans to whites starts to drop, African culture tends to fade. In the northern colonies, slaves never made up more than 10% of a colonial population. Slaves there worked as artisans, as farmhands, personal servants. So in the north, they adopted European ways, and African culture tended to fade, but it never disappeared. Slavery quickly became a major labor system in the southern colonies, but it was also prevalent with political support in New York City. It played a more minor role in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Here you can see the African burial ground in what is today near Foley Square in Lower Manhattan. And that African burial ground was discovered to exist in the 1990s as renovations were being conducted on City Hall in New York. And so construction was stopped. Anthropologists came in, they set aside many graves and grave sites, and now it's a national monument, the African burial ground. This is a group of slaves in Philadelphia at what was called the London Coffee House. The London Coffee House served as a center for economic transactions in early Philadelphia. In this image, an auction block with slaves that I've circled there in red, with slaves standing on it, is visible outside the coffee house. For colonial Philadelphians, a slave sale or a slave auction would have been a common sight. The first slaves arrived in Pennsylvania in 1684 and disembarked not far from this actual site. Slave auctions were just one of many transactions conducted at the coffee house, which is really like a business exchange. One way that slaves in North America lent meaning and dignity to their life was by resistance and rebellion. Resistance and rebellion were two ways that slaves made their lives more meaningful and tried to build a culture under that very strict system. Why did slaves resist? What was their motive for resisting? It wasn't to be rebellious, as some slave holders thought. It was a way for them to maintain their dignity and make their life more meaningful. Less common than resistance or things like that were uprisings, armed insurrections. And uprisings like the New York City Rebellion in 1712 or the Stono, South Carolina Rebellion in 1739, as you can see here, involved new arrivals. New arrivals tended to engage in armed uprising more than slaves who had been born in America or those who had been here a very long time. It's not that slaves born in America or slaves who had been here a long time got used to slavery. On the contrary, it's just that they tried other ways to adapt to it. And of course, many ran away and things like that. But new arrivals are less accustomed to being enslaved. So they statistically were more likely to be involved in an armed uprising or insurrection like this one. Slaves remained in the minority in all the colonies except South Carolina, and tension between Indians and slaves and severe, harsh reprisals against rebels discouraged mass uprisings and fortified slave communities that you saw elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. This is a chart that contains important observations about the New York City Rebellion of 1712. Now, this is, of course, what we call a primary document. And on the face of it, it doesn't look that meaningful when you look into it. Now, these are the number of slaves imported into New York between 1701 and 1726. Now, notice on the left-hand column, there are years, 1701, 1702, 1703, and so on. The blue arrow on the left points to 1712. That is when the New York City Rebellion occurred on April 16th, 1712. Then you'll notice in the second column with the blue circle, it's not exactly a circle, but the blue oval, it says slaves from the West Indies, and the red oval says slaves from the slaves from the coast of Africa. So you can see in the years leading up to 1712, there are no, between 1705 and 1712, there are no slaves who come into New York from the West Indies. That's important because if they came in from the West Indies, they were already acclimated or somewhat accustomed to the slave system. But notice how many slaves from the coast of Africa came into New York. In 1705, 24, 1710, 53, and we're looking at the second red circle here. 24, 53, 55, and 77. That means if you add those 4 years together, it means that between 1705 and 1712, 209 African slaves arrived in New York City. And then the New York City Rebellion occurred. So no slaves came in 1713, and then in 1714, in the yellow circle, you can see that not a single slave came into New York City between the New York City Rebellion of 1712 and 1714, while 53 slaves came in from the West Indies. So a lot of Africans come in, then there's a rebellion, and then no Africans for 2 years. And then they come back in very, very slowly. So that's, I think that this particular table, these statistics support the idea that Africans were involved in the rebellion, and then that involvement prevented any further imports of them for at least 2 years. Much more common than a slave uprising or an armed rebellion was resistance, which could be both subtle or sort of indirect or very direct. One way to resist was by running away. Recently imported slaves often escaped to the frontier, where they established maroon settlements, lived among the Indians, or found refuge in Spanish Florida. This is a runaway slave advertisement. And we'll, of course, look at these, many more of these as we go. That's one way to resist, by running away. Subtle or indirect forms of resistance included things like work slowdowns, faked illness, pretended ignorance, and breaking of tools. More direct forms of resistance included arson, crop destruction, stealing, truancy, and assaults on supervisors, which is what we apparently see taking place in this image. This is one way that slaves in America gave meaning and dignity to their lives. Another way that slaves gave meaning and dignity to their lives was by religion and belief in God. Now, slaves, African slaves in America, continued to practice indigenous African religion that was central to their lives. And also, they resisted the master's religion. And most masters professed to be Christians. Now, this is not an attack on Christians. If anything, it's only a critique of Christians or anybody else who use religion to enslave people. So I want to be clear about that. But slaves resisted the master's religion. And why wouldn't they? Why would they want to convert to a religion of someone who enslaved them, unless it was a forced conversion? And if one were to study church records, you would be able to see that for many years, Africans in America did go to church largely because they had to. But in the 1740s, many African Americans, especially in northern colonies like Massachusetts and Connecticut, many slaves started to embrace a new idea that they heard being preached. And what was that new idea? That God loves everybody the same. And so slaves then created their own version of Christianity based on the foundational or main idea that God is impartial and God loves everyone the same. Male and female, white and black, rich and poor, free and slave. And they added to that idea that God loves everyone the same, the West African idea or emphasis that you can suffuse or fill this world with heavenly power. And in the process, they created Black Christianity, a hybrid form of Christianity that is premised or built on the foundation of God's impartial love, but rejects the religion of the master. One of the most important 19th century proponents of Black Christianity was this man, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass wrote an important autobiography, and in it, he was very critical of religious people. And so he found it necessary to write an afterword, a sort of a little addition after the book ends, to show that he's not, to show why he made so many more, to explain to his readers why he made so many remarks against religion. And this is what he said. This is an extended quote from Frederick Douglass. What I have said, he wrote, what I have said against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ, where impartial means God loves everyone the same. Therefore, I hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. So he wasn't against Jesus Christ's version of Christianity. He was against the master's version of Christianity, specifically Christianity that looks the other way when it comes to enslaving people. So Black Christianity then, just to reiterate, joined or connected together the idea that God loves everyone the same with the indigenous West African desire to fill this world with heavenly power. And they created Black Christianity. Now, they weren't able to practice that yet in churches of their own, but after the American Revolution in the northern states, when Black churches began to form for the first time, that is what Black Christians practice. They reject the religion of the master, but they practice Black Christianity. Another way that Africans in America gave meaning to their lives was through the family. In fact, the family is the main instrument or vehicle through which African American culture is passed on to children and to grandchildren. Family and kinship ties, as we know, characterized West African social life. And so slaves tried to rebuild those relationships here. Most colonies prohibited slave marriages, but most masters compromised, thinking that slaves would work harder and be less likely to run away if they were allowed to form families like this couple on your screen. The fact is, a lot of married slaves still ran away and then came back to get their loved ones. I should go back just for a moment. I want to make one other thing clear. Black family life was always very fragile because masters did allow slave marriages, but what the master gave, the master could take away. And it was not uncommon for cruel masters to sell away a man and strip him away from his family, sometimes without even being able to say goodbye. So it was very, very difficult. And of course, many slave women were impregnated by the master or a male member of the master's family in a rape. So those children also faced difficulties because they didn't really fit into either world exactly. Despite such obstacles, slaves were able to build fairly stable families. That is, we see slave families as a glass half full, not a glass half empty. The miracle is that the black families were as strong as they were, given the distinct disadvantages against them. Now we switch gears a little bit here on this point to talk about the struggle for land. The desire for land did cause conflicts, and we will look at two land wars, by no means the only two, but one in the north, King Philip's War, and one in the south, Bacon's Rebellion, that occurred at almost exactly the same time. And we will see the consequences of these wars. This is an engraving of Metacom, or Metacomet. Metacom was an Indian in the north, and the English called him King Philip. The struggle for land in New England led to King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, 1675 and 1676. The desire for land in New England, that means Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and that area, caused conflicts between whites and Native Americans that brought destruction of life and property on both sides and left a legacy of bitterness. After the Pequot War of 1637, Native Americans tried to avoid and stay out of the way of colonists, but New Englanders coveted Indian land and then moved to place Indians under English law in order to humiliate them. And by the 1670s, younger Indians, led by Metacom, this man on your screen, began to form a resistance movement. King Philip's War was triggered when the English executed 3 Wampanoags in the 1670s. The Indians, the young Wampanoags, gathered together and formed a resistance movement. And they formed a military alliance to stop white intrusion and to revitalize their culture. By March of 1676, the combined tribes of New England were winning King Philip's War. White resistance was highly ineffective, as men evaded the draft, and the colonies remained politically divided, refusing to send help or money. But King Philip's offensive faltered in the spring of 1676, largely due to a combination of food shortages, disease, and the refusal of the Mohawks to come and help them. And by summer, the rebellion was over and Metacom was dead. But that war annihilated an entire generation of young men, white and Indian, and slowed down frontier development for another 40 years. This map shows Indian village sites before King Philip's War. Now you can see there's the New England area, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, those are today's boundaries. And then on the lower left, you can see a circle that shows a dot. A dot represents an Indian village. And you can see that Indian villages marked by that dot are located all across New England, or present-day Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. But you can see those Indian villages are everywhere. They're on the edges, they're inside, they're in the heartland. They're Indian villages everywhere before King Philip's War. But notice this map after King Philip's War. Indian village sites after King Philip's War. Now, in this case, an Indian village is represented by a diamond. After King Philip's War ended, Indian villages, represented again by a diamond, now were located only on the periphery or outer edges of southern New England, which would be, as we said, present-day Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Only one traditional Indian village was still located in the middle of the tri-colonial region. You can see that red arrow points to an Indian village near Assanamisco, which would be modern-day Worcester. So all the red ovals or circles or circle shows Indian villages, almost all at the outer edge, at the very edge, like pushed to the extreme edge there. The only Indian villages on the inside of the three colony area are in blue, in the blue circles, the blue ovals. Those are all what we call praying villages. Praying villages were made up of Indians who voluntarily converted to the Puritan religion. Sometimes they were called Red Puritans. So the only Indians viewed safe enough to live in the interior were in the praying villages, designated by a cross inside those circles. So, in other words, central Massachusetts was cleared of Indian settlement that had been there before the war. Now it's all those villages are cleared out. Indians are taken out of the center and, like a centrifuge, forced to the edge to clear the way for white settlement. So that was a very consequential war. King Philip's War, sometimes called Metacom's War. Another important land war took place in the South at exactly the same time, called Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion is very important, but for different reasons, as we will see. First of all, we already know that Bacon's Rebellion, we already know about the headright system. The headright system was the basis of indentured servitude in Virginia. An indentured servant would work for 7 years, typically, and at the end of the 7 years, he or she would receive 50 acres of land from the governor of Virginia, and then the master under whom he or she served would also get 50 acres. The problem was that by the 1670s, there was less and less land to give. The most available, the largest unused tract or area of land belonged to Indians, and it was protected by a treaty dating back to the 1640s. So planters coveted that land and went to the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley, and asked for that land to be given and put into the headright system. And the governor refused and said that he was going to honor the treaty. So planters, and I should also point out that servants were having to wait in line longer and longer amounts of months in order to get the land. So when they, in the earlier years, once you completed your indentures, you got your land right away. But now these ex-servants are landless and they're waiting, and they're very angry about having to wait because there's almost no land left to give them. So planters and these landless ex-servants want to start a war. They want to provoke a war with Indians because at the end of a war, you can have a war settlement or a treaty, and they would have as their goal to start a war, win it, and then in the treaty that would conclude or end the war, insert language to take the land protected in earlier treaties. So to start a war is a way to get land formally, and the Indians would sign off on it. So some planters tried to provoke a confrontation. Nathaniel Bacon, a small planter himself, tried to go all out and provoke a war between Virginia and Indians. And in the spring of 1676, Bacon and other frontiersmen launched a campaign against all Indians. The governor refused to approve of those attacks. He declared Bacon and his followers rebels, and then sent the militia to arrest them and bring them to Jamestown for trial. Instead, Bacon recruited more followers, burned Jamestown, and then the governor had to flee for his life. And so for a brief period of time, you have white anger and white solidarity, rich whites and poor whites who ordinarily would be separated, now having class and ethnic unity. Now, Bacon's rebellion ultimately failed. Bacon himself died an untimely death, and English troops arrived to suppress the rebellion. But when the smoke cleared, so to speak, the hatred of Indians inside Virginia became a permanent feature. And the leaders of Virginia had to make a decision because they realized now that indentured servitude was not sustainable, that it could not go on. So in order to avoid white anger and white intense white class unity, the decision was made to phase out indentured servitude, not take any new claims, and then slowly switch from indentured servitude to African slave labor, what we call racial slavery inside Virginia. So Bacon's Rebellion is very important because it shows us the sequence of events that led to the embrace of racial slavery by Virginia, and then ultimately Maryland and all the other colonies. Here you see a painting called The Burning of Jamestown, and in the center you can see Nathaniel Bacon and his followers. You can see for your reference, a lengthy explanation of what we just explained. It's a frightening moment, really, when Virginia's government almost toppled. But the way to resolve it, the leaders of Virginia concluded, was to bring in racial slavery. So the results of Bacon's Rebellion were that whites of all classes unite, Virginians turn away from indentured servitude, and embrace African slave labor instead. This is a picture of Gordon, scourged back, 1863. I put this here to show the dynamics of what we call racial slavery. This photograph was taken by the great photographer Matthew Brady in 1863 during the Civil War. The original caption to this photograph said this, and these are the words apparently of Gordon, sometimes called Poor Peter. Overseer Artayu Carrier whipped me. I was 2 months in bed, sore from the whipping. My master come after I was whipped. he discharged the overseer. The very words of poor Peter taken to his hat for his picture. This is a portrait of the wife of a very wealthy rice planter from South Carolina. Mary Elliott and her husband Barnard were among the wealthiest landowners in 1760s South Carolina, with a rice plantation exceeding 1,000 acres, while Mr. Elliott held high political office in that state. And I'm told by historians of fashion that the clothes she is wearing are made from the finest materials that one could import from around the world, not to mention the wealth demonstrated by her jewelry. I have juxtaposed or put together these two images. In the words of the great historian from Yale University, Edmund Morgan, this represents American slavery and American freedom. When racial slavery began after Bacon's Rebellion, white Americans increasingly perceived that both their freedom from class conflict and their prosperity rested on denying freedom to Black Americans. Unquote. So in other words, the slavery and sadism and cruelty on the left, the slavery of many on the left made possible the wealth and privilege of a few on the right. Or literally, what you see on the right was built on the back or the backs of what you see on the left. Because as we said, slavery was the foundation of the Southern economic system. And I think that these two pictures portray that clearly, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. This column, this chart, has a column that I have singled out. English tobacco imports from the Chesapeake slave plantations. That's why these primary documents are so important if you really think about what they mean in human terms, in real terms. Now, it says tobacco in 1 million pounds. It shows the imports of tobacco into England starting in 1746 and ending in 1762. So if you look, for example, on the left is a 1746, it says 40, it says 40, it should be 40.0, not 400. 40 million pounds, because it's 40 in millions. So it's 40 million pounds of tobacco were imported into England just in that 1 year. And you can see it's growing. So if you add up everything in the red rectangle, in the 17-year period between 1746 and 1762, if you add those numbers up, England imported a total of 810 million pounds of tobacco, or an average of 47.6 million pounds every year. Most of that tobacco came from Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, and all of it was grown, harvested, packed, and sent by slaves. Consider this chart that shows the number of slaves imported just into Charleston, South Carolina in the years leading up to the American Revolution. When European demand for tobacco grew as well as rice, when European demand for tobacco grew sharply during the 18th century, the newly dominant slave labor system started to expand rapidly. Between 1700 and 1770, we know from another source that approximately 80,000 Africans arrived in the tobacco colonies, that would be Maryland and Virginia. Tobacco planting spread from Virginia and Maryland to Delaware, North Carolina. And then from the coastal plain into the foothills going in a westerly direction, all the way to the Appalachian Mountains. In the process, American slavery began to assume the form it kept for the next century and a half. As the chart above shows, approximately 80,000 additional slaves were trafficked into one port of South Carolina, Charleston, between 1706 and 1773 to supply an enslaved labor force to produce rice. So slavery is growing by leaps and bounds in the tobacco colonies and in the rice colonies, and of course, even more in Georgia. Slave labor made possible, the economic growth and development of the region that included Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. With time, colonial economic growth, especially in the tobacco and rice economies of the South, was tied to slave labor. And in fact, in this very detail of a map from 1755, you can see slaves at the port with hogsheads or barrels of tobacco ready for export. One has been opened for inspection, apparently. The last point of this lecture is titled An Era of Instability. An Era of Instability. Organizing the empire. First of all, in 1688, there was a revolution in England called the Glorious Revolution. And a Catholic king, James II, was removed from office and replaced by William and Mary, two Protestant monarchs, a king and a queen, as co-regents. And they tried very hard to organize the empire, which had not really been modernized yet. One way that they organized the empire was through a system called mercantilism. Mercantilism. Now, first of all, what is an empire? An empire is the mother country, whether it be England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, or whatever, and her colonies or settlements overseas. So you have the mother colony in England, then you have all of her colonies. Together, the mother country and her colonies is called an empire. Mercantilism was a system to regulate and structure the relationship between the mother country and her colonies. Here you see a painting of a port, and you see the large amounts of merchandise being trafficked. How did the mother country benefit from mercantilism? First of all, the English, under mercantilist theory, believed that they believed that colonies, like the 13 American colonies, existed to benefit the mother country. So it's sort of a strange image. We usually think of a mother caring for her children, but in this case, the mother country wants her children to take care of her. And there were 4 ways that colonies benefited the mother country, or 4 ways the mother country benefited from having colonies. First, colonies served as markets for manufactured goods made in England. So the mother country merchants in England made goods, manufactured goods, and then sent them to the American colonies where they would be purchased. Secondly, the colonies provided foodstuffs, or large amounts of food and raw materials, to the mother country. So a place like North America had a lot of raw materials and different food sources. So England, which was very cold and very far north and had a difficult time growing enough food for its population, could inexpensively get food from the colonies and take it to England. Also, the colonies stimulated trade and a larger maritime or ship culture. And then lastly, colonists paid customs or taxes into the national treasury. This is sort of a diagram that I put together. At the top, well, first on the right, you see the mother country, England, and on the left, you see the 13 American colonies. The mother country from the colonies, the mother country gets food. That would be fish, rice, beef, put in barrels, grains like wheat and oats and barley, and staples like tobacco, indigo, and lumber. So all those foodstuffs and staples and naval stores and stuff go to England. She takes those and turns them into manufactured goods, and then turns around and sends those to the American colonies, and it sort of goes in this cycle like that. But the real beneficiary, the main beneficiary, would be the mother country. What did the colonies get from this system? First, they got protection from the mother country. England would send troops and the English army to the colonies to suppress a rebellion. There were ships on the high seas to protect the sea lanes from piracy and things like that. Plus, the colonies also got guaranteed markets in the mother country. So if you grow tobacco or rice, indigo, or you raise beef or wheat or whatever, you can send all those things to the mother country, but you won't get the price that you want. So because once you're in the international system, supply and demand sort of sets the prices. So what the English are willing to pay is not always what the Americans want them to pay. So American merchants then can't get the price that they want, and they're not allowed under mercantilism to trade with the Spanish or the Dutch or the French. They can only trade with England. It's very restrictive and highly regulatory. In this case, you can see one benefit of mercantilism because colonies did get protection from the mother country. In this case, English naval supremacy would protect her colonies in North America and in the Caribbean from naval attacks by Dutch or Spanish ships, as you see taking place here. You see the English Navy's attacked some ships and destroyed them. England moves to regulate its colonies. Again, mercantilism is highly regulatory. It's a lot of rules and restrictions that Americans don't really like. This is called the Samson, the Salvador, and the St. George. 3 Dutch ships masquerading as Spanish vessels in order to circumvent or get around the Navigation Act. So sometimes ships will go out to sea if American ships can't trade with the Spanish or the French or the Dutch. They will go out and strike the colors. They'll pull the flag down and run up another flag to sort of masquerade and pretend they're from another country. It's complicated, but the point is American merchants found these restrictions very onerous and they interfered very much from the profits they thought they could earn if there were free trade. I put up a quote here, or commentary. Before 1660, England moved slowly to regulate its colonial empire. In 1651, in an effort to cut American colonial trade with its Dutch commercial rival, England passed a Navigation Act requiring that English or colonial ships manned by English or colonial sailors carry all goods entering England, Ireland, and the colonies. That is, they can't enter any other colony, and every ship coming in must have English sailors. After the restoration of the British monarchy in 1660, a more comprehensive Navigation Act was passed that imposed duties or taxes that limited the sale of an enumerated list of products like tobacco, sugar, and indigo, and so on. The bottom paragraph is very important. Mercantilism did not allow American merchants to get the highest price for their goods since they had to trade only with England, and trade with other nations was not allowed. Slowly but surely, England exercised greater and greater control over trade, since mercantilism was designed to benefit the mother country. To summarize, by the 1720s, England's North American colonies controlled the new environment. By subduing Indians and enslaving Africans, they had begun to erect the basic structures of colonial life, secured them against European competitors, and became generally, but not entirely, self-reliant. So the colonies are maturing and solidifying and stabilizing. But they do it in large part by building that economic freedom and wealth on the backs of slaves. And that problem, embedded so deeply in American colonial life, will never be resolved until there's a civil war, and its effect will linger, some would argue, to the present hour. Thank you very much for your patience. I hope this lecture was interesting and informative. If you have questions, please let me know, and we'll be happy to try to make that point clear to you. Thank you very much.